like to start tonight with a question for you all. What does someone working in agriculture look like, and what do they do? Particularly those working in the grains industry, producing wheat that delivers the bread, the cereals, the biscuits, the pasta to our supermarkets every day. Picture that and hold it for a while. My journey in agriculture started almost 50 years ago, learning to drive a tractor as a youngster on a family farm. At the time, the world's population was less than 4 billion. The average wheat production was about a tonne to the hectare, and an air-conditioned cabin was an optional extra. And frankly, you're a bit soft if you thought you needed an air-conditioned cabin, because at the day, pretty much all problems in agriculture could be solved by simply working harder. And perhaps it's that sort of dusty farmer working harder that might have informed your vision of what does agriculture look like. Fast forward to today, and the world's population has more than doubled to over 8 billion people. We've managed to keep up with feeding that population by almost doubling our wheat production in Australia on average to about 2 tonnes to the hectare. And we've been able to achieve that by farmers adopting an amazing array of improved practices, new products, using new technology, and increasingly starting to rely on data. But also, we're adding and asking farmers to do more. They no longer just have to be an agronomist or a livestock operator. They need to report on biosecurity. They need to be aware of natural capital. They need to be aware of cybersecurity. There are all these different aspects to managing and running a farm that were just unheard of decades ago. But they're becoming increasingly critical in producing and growing the food that we eat. And almost ironically, we're also entering an age where that air-conditioned cab is not so much becoming optional as simply becoming redundant. We're moving into an age where robotics, electronics, data are increasingly everywhere. And tonight I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey about what does growing a crop look like today as a guide for what it might look like going into the future, and to pose that question, can data and technology feed the world? If we think about a farmer about to think about growing some wheat, one of the most fundamental things they need to know is the soil resource that they're working with. So to understand that soil, they might use one of the thousands and thousands of satellite images that have been taken over the last 20 years of pretty much every farm on the planet, to be able to identify patterns in plant growth. They can identify where are the parts of the paddock that are producing more crop, where are the parts of the paddock that are producing less crop, which are the parts of the farm that are actually unsuitable for growing crops, and where are the parts of the farm where they could be pushing the system even further. It might be that they've mounted some electromagnetic or some radiometric sensors to some of their equipment to be able to actually map the soil characteristics in quite fine detail to help build up that picture as to what is the capability of their soil and what are the things that they need to be doing with it. They go through that process, they decide, yes, they're going to be planting some wheat. As they start to get ready for the season ahead, they might need to be controlling some weeds. It's now eminently doable to employ a robot, an autonomous spray unit that from the shed will drive itself out to the paddock, unfold, and if the weather conditions are right, it will then start driving along backwards and forwards in the fallow, using infrared sensors to detect where the weeds are. It's not applying a blanket of herbicide, it's simply identifying where is the weed, and when it sees the weed, it sprays it. And that sort of technology can be reducing herbicide use in a fallow situation by over 90%. And that's a good thing for the farmer financially, but it's also a good thing environmentally, and it's a good thing for the future because it actually prolongs the life of those chemicals and the efficiency of those chemicals. Moves on towards getting ready to actually plant the crop, and the farmer might be thinking, well, which of the tractors am I going to be using today? Is it the 500 or 600 horsepower autonomous electric tractor, or is it the hydrogen powered tractor? If he's going down the hydrogen powered tractor, he might go into the local co-op, which has got a small solar farm, which is using solar energy to convert water into hydrogen, and then using that to generate green hydrogen or green ammonium fertiliser. These are processes that are starting to commence, and a green hydrogen tractor, green ammonium fertiliser can contribute significantly to growing a crop that's actually a carbon neutral crop, and that's, as consumers, that's what we're wanting them to do. Crop goes into the ground, and we've then got several months of the crop actively growing along, and every day potentially needing care. So across the farm, there's actually a network of sensors, both above ground, below ground, and on a daily basis, there are satellites passing over, taking infrared images. All this information is coming in, some of it directly to the farmer, but some of it directly just to data systems that are bringing all this information and saying, well, what's the risk of a climatic condition or a disease outbreak or a weed outbreak? Some of these things are autonomously happening and just presenting solutions to the farmer or the consultant to make decisions. Or quite often, it's simply presenting data that someone needs to be looking at. A lot of these technologies don't actually provide the answers. They actually provide challenges to someone who's managing the crop about, well, what are you going to do with this? Because not all farmers are the same, and presenting the same information to 5 different farmers might lead to 5 different decisions based on their personal circumstances. And we always need to remember that, we're not building robots or farmers, we're all individual. But there's lots and lots of this data, it's flowing through. Again, weed management is going to be a rather large component of growing the crop successfully. And so again, the autonomous robots have been sent out into the paddock to perhaps over the next 3 weeks be continuously just driving backwards and forwards slowly across the paddock. This time, rather than using infrared sensors to detect where there's a weed, there's confusion because there's actively growing crops and there's actively growing weeds. So in this instance, you're going to be using imaging systems, which are literally processing millions of pixels a second to use pattern recognition to be able to actually identify, well, actually, that looks like a weed because I know that the crops looks like this over here. And if it can then do that, it might well turn on a system that just uses a single nozzle to spray a herbicide on that particular weed. Or if in the short term or in the short future we're able to adapt some technologies that are currently being used in horticultural industries, it might be that rather than using a herbicide, there's a whole row of lasers underneath the system, and it simply points a laser at the weed, fires a beam, weed's dead, move on. It might be that it uses microwave technology. It might be that it uses steam. It might be that it actually puts out an electrode and electrocutes the plant. There are all these different systems that are currently being used at commercial scale in some instances in other industries that are soon to be investigated and look to be adapted to be used in broadacre cropping. And so there's a world of technology that's coming along, and it's a world of data that's being generated as we move. We get to harvest time, and again, the harvest operation, possibly one of those last operations where the person sitting in the machine is going to become redundant. But there are sensors all over the harvesters that are operating it, speeding it up, slowing it down based on the amount of material that's coming through them. But there are also sensors that are measuring the yield every second. There are sensors that are measuring the quality every second. And that information becomes vital to the farmer to be able to plan next year's nutrition or program, to be able to market their crop, to be able to put all this information together to be making better decisions, more sustainable decisions. And ultimately, the grain ends up in a silo somewhere. And to a large extent, all the decisions up to this point have been relatively real time. That data has something of a short shelf life. The action happens, data comes along, decisions made. But once the grain's in the silo, the data actually starts to become even more critical because that's where consumers become involved. As consumers, we're increasingly demanding, not just requesting, we're actually demanding to know how is our food produced. Is it produced sustainably? What was the carbon footprint of that particular crop? And the only way that can be achieved is by being able to access this data. And certainly it's not a question of asking farmers to sit down at the end of the season and start filling out reams and reams and reams of paperwork. If we can develop these systems that take all this data and can automate that whole process to generate reports so that as it is at the moment where some European markets require, before we send our canola to Europe, that farmers declare and fill out quite comprehensive sustainability reports. It says you've not used certain practices, that you have used other things, so that the consumer sitting in France or Germany can be confident that their wheat bix or their biscuits have grown, are using products that have come along in a particular way. And so these things are actually happening. It's also increasingly the case that finance institutions are wanting to know this information as well. And it's not because the banks have got any particular interest in how producers are growing things, but it's the shareholders of the banks that are demanding the banks that they only invest in farmers that are doing things sustainably, that are meeting the criteria of the shareholders who are ultimately consumers. And one of the challenges is that quite often those requirements don't have a whole lot to do with science. The consumers aren't out there, conducting experiments and determining that this is a good practice or that's a good practice. It's what they think is happening that actually becomes the rule, and it becomes the social license, if you like, that a producer has to be able to grow a crop. And so, as remotely as we might seem to be from the actual act of growing a crop, we're all very much part of the process of enabling producers to do what it is that they've been wanting to do. And there's often a lot of talk about, well, it's the family farms, maybe they're doing things sustainably, but it's the corporates who are just in it for the dollar. But again, I think it's possibly it's the corporates and their shareholders that are actually demanding that the practices that they undertake are fully auditable, fully sustainable, and meet the requirements of the consumer and the shareholders to some extent, regardless of the cost. It's the shareholder says you will do this, and if there's an actual cost to production, well, just bad luck. That's what's going to happen. So we're in this environment where all these sorts of things are happening. We've got all this technology, we've got all this data. Science says that while our average wheat yield at the moment in Australia is about 2 tonnes to the hectare, is that technically we can almost double that. That if all farmers were doing all things exactly at the right time and the right way, we could almost double that production again. But ultimately, it doesn't matter how much data and technology there is, it's people that are actually going to determine that. We're going to need many, many more people involved in agriculture to develop and build the technology systems, to actually support the systems and educate the farmers in how to use them. We're going to be able to, or going to have to, be training farmers in how all these things fit together and giving them the confidence that they can use these things reliably. Confidence that there's a decent return on investment, because perhaps one of our issues is for 20 years ag tech companies have been selling shiny things to farmers. It's really easy to generate pretty pictures and nice maps and talk about drones that do all these cool things, but if there's no actual return on investment, then it becomes a bad investment. So we're actually going to need people to be sorting farmers to be able to do that. We're going to need to have governments to continue to provide the market conditions that and the regulations that allow producers to do the things that need to be done. And finally, I think it really does come back to us, the consumers, to maintain the social licence and condition the social licence to be appropriate for what is sustainable food production. And so finally tonight, I'd throw another question back to you that following on from this evening is when you think about who's involved in agriculture now and what it is that an agriculturalist does, perhaps you have a slightly different opinion. Thank you.